Hello and welcome to our second lecture in abnormal psychology. We're going to be covering material primarily from chapter 2 of your textbook in this lecture, which is an integrative approach to psychopathology. Our primary concern in this chapter is to talk about models, various ways of making sense of psychopathology, how do we define it, how do we classify it, and this also has implications for how we treat it and how we treat it as a culture in some cases. We're going to distinguish between different types of models, including sort of what they call unidimensional or one-dimensional models that only look at psychopathology from a single perspective, versus models which are more dominant today, models that we're going to apply that are multidimensional, that consider various different ways of thinking about it. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the biology, including genetic contributions to psychopathology, neuroscience, cognitive science, and then we're going to move into some of the more quote-unquote psychological perspectives, we might say, of behavioral and cognitive psychology, humanistic and existential approaches. We're going to talk a little bit about emotions and how they relate to models of psychopathology. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit more generally about cultural, social, interpersonal factors in lifespan development. So over the course of this chapter, we're going to discuss the features of unidimensional versus multidimensional, and then various different ways of looking at psychopathology. So we need to start off by defining what we mean when we say a model. That may seem, very obvious to many of you, but essentially when I use that term in this class, I'm talking about different theoretical viewpoints or perspectives on what it means to be disordered in one's behavior in one form or another. Models are essentially analogies that describe a phenomenon that is otherwise difficult to describe or explain. So we often borrow terms, concepts, principles from one field and apply them to another. So linguistically speaking, you might hear a physician describe the human eye as a camera, for example, because that's the model they're using to explain something quite complex. A much more sort of obvious one in this class is the idea of quote-unquote mental illness. Mental illness is a controversial term to some degree to regard psychopathology, but it does borrow from medicine, and it often applies a medical model to psychopathology. So due to the complexity of human behavior, we can never expect to develop a definitive model, one single model. Rather, we just use models as heuristics, as shorthand for visualizing psychopathology as if it truly worked in the manner we're describing it by these models. We're always maintaining a willingness to revise those models and to integrate other effective models. So these are just tools. These are not absolute truth with a capital T, and you don't have to take them as gospel, but these are various ways to make sense of psychopathology. Models help us to conceptualize the causes or the etiology of a particular disorder. They help us to ask relevant questions in understanding it. We utilize our models in how we gather and interpret data. Different models have heavier or lighter reliances on scientific rigor. And then we're going to utilize our model to design and evaluate our treatment approaches. As you remember in abnormal psychology, we're going to spend a lot of time classifying and describing these disorders, but ultimately the applicability in clinical psychology is what we're really interested in, is what can we do to help alleviate the suffering of people that are dealing with these illnesses to have a better quality of life, to function more effectively. And your model that you apply will often dictate to a certain extent how you're going to want to treat that disorder, and then how you're going to evaluate that treatment. So I mentioned there's going to be a distinction between one-dimensional, aka unidimensional, and multidimensional models. So as you can imagine, a one-dimensional model explains behavior in terms of a single cause. It sort of puts all of the onus on that one particular cause as an explanation for why someone has disordered behavior. It could mean a paradigm, a school, a conceptual approach, a theoretical viewpoint. We tend to ignore information from other areas when we embrace one-dimensional models. There's a phenomenon in social psychology called confirmation bias, which is the idea that when you have already sort of established beliefs about something, when you then go to investigate that thing, you tend to emphasize examples that reinforce your viewpoint and de-emphasize those that run contrary to it. So that's the bias that we have to confirm our own pre-existing beliefs. And confirmation bias is a fascinating topic that could be its entire class on its own. But when you have a one-dimensional model, it often means that you might ignore evidence that that sort of takes away from the validity of your model, and you may really put too much emphasis and too much attention and shine too much light on examples where your model holds up. Um, One example we can think of is explaining obsessive compulsive disorder as a result of family history alone. There was certainly a perspective, probably 40s, 50s, that said that obsessive compulsive disorder was a byproduct of sort of over-nurturing mothers and things like that, or family systems. As we know, it could be a lot of other causes. So we don't want to dismiss other options when we have a one-dimensional approach. Opposed to that is a multidimensional approach, which is interdisciplinary, it's eclectic, and it tries to integrate, which is what we're going to do in this chapter. It tries to integrate lots of viewpoints. You sort of take the best of each, and you can discard some of the things that are not supported by evidence and come up with something that maybe is not unidimensional in its perspective. It may not have that clarity of a one-dimensional model, but it is in fact more accurate and likely to be more valid. So we often look at the system of influences that cause and maintain suffering. It's not one singular thrust or causal factor, but rather the interplay and the inner dynamics between multiple factors. We often get information when we're multidimensional in our approach from lots of different sources. We consider various ways of understanding a human being. We might do a brain scan of some type to look at the sort of underlying biological organic process, but we might also interview that person and ask them questions about their subjective emotional experience. We might ask them questions about their development and their history, and we may utilize techniques that draw from various different approaches in that process. Abnormal behavior, we do know, results from multiple influences. There is no one simple solution that explains all of abnormal psychology or abnormal behavior as a whole. So there is plenty of evidence to say that one-dimensional models are not sufficient. The real question then is what gets included in our multidimensional model. So there are some major areas of influence we want to consider when we think about multidimensional models. These are the places we're going to draw information and perspectives from in trying to build up some integrative approach. And these major areas are biological, behavioral, emotional. I'm going to talk a little bit about humanistic and existential models, social and cultural, developmental, and environmental. There's a lot of overlap between some of these, but these are just kind of the major thrusts of thought over the years in creating models to explain abnormal behavior. So if you go back to the first chapter of the book, there is a little story there about Judy and her development of a phobia. And if you don't remember from the chapter, Judy is a 16-year-old girl. She watches watches a film in biology class along with other students that is detailing frog dissection, and it's very visceral and kind of shows a lot of, sort of blood and tissue and things like that. And she has this powerful reaction to it, and she can't stop thinking about it. And then subsequently, Judy begins to develop fainting spells, which are associated with the stimulus of anything related to blood injections, or anything really visceral and sort of bodily in nature. And so she has developed this situation where it is now a true disorder. I think in the anecdote in the book, they talk about how she's fainting 5 to 10 times a week in class, and that it causes a lot of uproar, and that eventually this leads the principal of the school to assume that she's sort of attention seeking and that this is not a valid illness of some kind, and therefore she's suspended and forced to enroll in homeschool, I think is what it says. But basically the idea is it's crossed a line. It's become very problematic for her. We would certainly all agree, I think, based upon our definition of what constitutes a disorder, that it is causing Judy distress. She gets very upset whenever she's exposed to anything that triggers her, and she's starting to overgeneralize those triggers. There's a line in the anecdote where someone says the phrase "cut it out," and she associates that with the vision of the scalpel cutting up the frog, and therefore starts to have another fainting spell. So it's becoming pervasive, and it's starting to affect all aspects of her life. But when we want to explain the etiology, the cause behind Judy's phobia, there's several different models we could apply. So there's a behavioral factor. From a very old-fashioned kind of behavioral psychology perspective, she has been essentially conditioned to respond this way to the sight of blood. Her brain has made a connection between blood or viscera and this feeling of unease that she's developed, this visceral reaction that she has. There's biological factors. We do know there are some inherited tendencies for some of these types of situations like blood injury, injection phobia, certainly other types of disorders. So maybe, this is something that's passed down in her DNA to a certain extent from her parents. There's the physiological aspect here, right? She's having physiological symptoms that are probably associated with her autonomic nervous system, with the panic attack sort of phenomenon that we see quite frequently in anxiety disorders. So she's having lightheadedness, dizziness. She's probably having tachycardia. She might be sweating. She's probably hyperventilating a little bit. There's a lot of physiology going on in this situation. There's emotional influences. It's just tied to her fear and her anxiety about injury and about just sort of her response to the realities of the biology of the body. And then there's a social factor. Perhaps unfortunately, the principal seems like they focused on this issue, right? They feel this is attention seeking, but whether she's doing it on purpose or not, which we're in this anecdote, we're assuming that she is not doing this on purpose, right? Based upon the information that we have. She is gaining attention and she is sort of disrupting things. And so there's a social factor at play here. This is just one example of how you can see this sort of interactive, synergistic effect of how these and other models make it really difficult to sort of parse out only one element as being important, that we need to understand all of these influences in context. This slide, which is taken from your book, just shows us a visual representation of what I just discussed. This idea that we have these various different influences that are not only influencing the cause of Judy's phobia, but they are interacting with one another. And you can kind of see this visualization of the whole picture here. So to go back to be more general and talk about models in general, we do know there are some genetic contributions to psychopathology, and this has certainly been growing in evidence over the years as we develop more ability to examine, investigate, and track aspects of DNA. So, of course, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the nature of genes of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, which is the double helix structure you find at the nucleus of every cell in our bodies that sort of carries all of our genetic information. It's one of the really fascinating things about genetics, this discovery that essentially the whole story of your existence as a biological entity is essentially written inside every individual cell. I'm sure many of you are know more than I do about genetics, so I won't delve too much into it. But we each have 46 chromosomes and 23 pairs. Half of those chromosomes, or 50% of your DNA, is contributed by your biological parent. And we have things such as dominant and recessive genes, genes that tend to be expressed if only one of your parents contributes, versus those that need both of your parents contributing to see that particular trait or aspect of your biology manifested. And we know that DNA determines a lot of things about our physical and our mental characteristics. So first of all, we need to distinguish between genotype and phenotype. This is going to be a very quick crash course, obviously, but genotype is the genetic status. Within the DNA of an individual, is there a certain allele for a certain condition or that's associated with a disorder or just a certain trait? The phenotype is how that gene is then manifested in that person. So, for example, you could have the genetic status to have blue eyes, but if your other parent has brown eyes, which are dominant, the phenotype that expresses itself might be brown eyes. But we can go even deeper beyond things like superficial appearance, and we know now there's some genetic evidence for things like a tendency for fear of social rejection, and things that cross much more into the psychology world and less into the biology world. Now, you can very quickly oversimplify the influence of DNA and of genetics in this process. So it is very important that we know that when it comes to psychology, when it comes to behavior, which is very complex in its structure and its causal relationships between various influences, we know that they are often not only influenced by various different forces, but that they are polygenetic. There's not a single gene for a lot of these things that we're investigating. We know that it's a contribution of several genes that add up to a certain outcome. So this is sort of the groundwork, the basic environment we think about when we think about genetic contributions to psychopathology. So development and behavior, as I said, is almost always polygenetic. It's not simple. There are a few rare examples of single gene determinants in biology, Huntington's disease or PKU, both of which are illnesses that we know have extremely strong genetic components. Huntington's disease is a very awful progressive neurological disorder. Essentially, if you have a parent that has this disease, you have a 50% chance of having this disease. And it is invariably fatal, and it's a pretty bad way to go. The famous American folk singer Woody Guthrie passed away of Huntington's disease, and he had children who were also themselves artists and performers. Arlo Guthrie, for example, and it was sort of this fearful waiting process by a lot of their fans and friends and family to wait and see. Fortunately, neither Arlo or Nora Guthrie developed Huntington's disease. But it is an awful illness, and it is one of those that we now have a genetic test for. So it used to be if you had a parent who had a confirmed diagnosis of Huntington's, you had to just essentially wait until symptoms did or did not emerge. We now can do some genetic testing at least to let the person know whether or not they are carrying the gene for Huntington's. Generally speaking, it's fair to say, and this is a very gross estimate, genes account for less than 50% of the variations we see in psychopathology. There is a genetic component, but it is not the primary and only determinant of whether or not you develop a certain psychopathology. There have been a lot of developments, as you well know, in the study of genes and genetics in general. There's been some estimates recently that heritability for cognitive traits is 30 to 60%. Now we're starting to cross that 50% line with certain characteristics, but again, that's a range and it's based upon limited evidence. We do know that adverse life events can trump the influence of genes. That environment matters a great deal as well. This is the nature versus nurture argument, right? Nature being, in this case, the genetic determinant, and nurture being your experiences as a human being. If only one identical twin experiences a traumatic life event, for example, the twin's cognitive ability may be more discrepant later. We do know that a serious or adverse life event can have a significant impact on a person's development of psychopathology. More recent research suggests that genetic contributions should not be considered without also considering the environment. This is essentially the message about genetics we need to consider. So Eric Kandel is a researcher who has developed a theory about gene-environment interactions. This is a way of accounting for the fact that behavior is not entirely determined by genetics. And when we talk about the gene-environment interaction, this can be the actual environment that the human being is growing up in, but there's even a lot of discussion about what goes on within the environment of the cell itself. If that DNA is present within the environment of a cell, well, those cells are in a body that is going through the process of eating, drinking, receiving vitamins and nutrients, all of which is affecting the cell itself. So there's a lot of ways you can look at this idea, but essentially the genetic structure of cells actually changes as a result of learning experiences. This is the crucial thing. What we're saying is that genes do not just determine the biology, but the biology also can affect the genes themselves in some ways, or at least the genetic structure of the cells. So an inactive gene may become active because of certain environmental influences. And there's several different ways to explain this, and we're going to talk about a few examples now. So this is the interaction of genetic and environmental effects sort of represented in a figure here. But the idea is that if you have a strong genetic proponent and then you experience something like severe maltreatment or some degree of maltreatment, what is the likelihood or the probability of developing a major depressive episode over the course of your life? And as you can see in this case, if the person has these two long alleles, these two particular genetic components, the likelihood of them developing major depression doesn't seem to increase despite their environmental influence. But if you have one and or both of these alleles that are indicators for major depression, what we see is a significant increase in the probability of a major depressive episode. So what you're seeing is the interaction between the genetics and the environment. The diathesis stress model, which is depicted in this little diagram here, is an attempt to make sense of or to develop a model that helps us explain how environment and genetics interact with one another. So essentially what you see here are two axes, an X and a Y. On one axis we have the degree of stressful environment, the amount of stress the individual might experience in their life, and on the other axis we have their genetic vulnerability for a particular disorder of some kind or another. So essentially there's an interplay or an interaction between the degree to which you are vulnerable genetically for a condition and how much appropriate, we might say, stress you undergo to bring about the manifestation or development of that disorder. So it's a result of underlying risk factors that are combining with life stress to see whether or not the disorder emerges. And as you can see from this crossover pattern here, if you have high genetic vulnerability and you undergo a high stress environment, there's a higher risk for developing, and vice versa. You may have a strong genetic vulnerability, but not experience a great deal of stress and therefore not ever developed or manifest the condition, or at least not to a clinical degree. You could also have a low genetic vulnerability, but undergo extremely high levels of stress, which would increase the chance of that disorder appearing. So this is just one way of making sense of that combination of how those two factors interplay with one another. This is another visualization from your book of the diathesis stress model. You might think about this line at the top of the glass as being, crossing that line and reaching the threshold for experiencing an actual psychological disorder. In this case, alcohol dependence or alcohol abuse. So what we see here is your genetic vulnerability, aka your diathesis, or and the life events sort of layering on top of one another. And you have two examples of individuals here. The stressor, in this case, the thing that's more likely to increase the expression of alcoholism or alcohol dependence that's environmental, is long bouts of drinking in college. So we know that people that drink in binge fashions or drink in higher amounts over time are more likely to develop alcohol dependence. And in these two individuals, one person has a large diathesis, a large tendency genetically, perhaps from their mother or father's side of the family, and they then undergo the appropriate amount of stressor in this case, which is drinking large amounts of alcohol over long periods of time, and then they cross this line and develop what we might call the disorder of alcoholism. Person number two does the same amount of drinking, same environmental stressor, but does not have that genetic propensity and therefore never develops the disorder. So this is one way of thinking about how genes and the environment interact. The reciprocal gene environment model is a slightly different way of thinking about it. This one is, rather than just stacking the two on top of one another, so to speak, or just looking at them as additive, what it says is that there actually is an interplay between both, and that in fact the environment itself can alter the genetic nature of the individual as well. So in this case, in this model, this reciprocal gene environment model, outcomes are a result of interactions between the genetic vulnerabilities and the experience. And so things like depression and impulsivity are thought to be interplays between these factors. So genetics may make people more likely to seek out certain environments, thus affecting your experiences. So it might not be that it's just a sufficient amount of stressor. It might be if you have a genetic propensity for impulsivity and then you engage in the appropriate stressors, you may be more likely to develop something like alcohol dependence, for example. This is a visualization of Judy's phobia utilizing the gene-environment correlation model. So what you see here is the red blood cells here, so to speak, are situations involving seeing blood. On person A, which might be Judy, for example, is somebody who has the genetic vulnerability to develop a blood injury injection of phobia. And what you're seeing in this figure is the idea that these two things are connected to one another. They are amplified by virtue of a tendency towards impulsiveness, attracting situations that might involve blood. So there's an interplay between the genes and the environment that's not just simply additive, that there is an interplay and a feedback loop that can be created by the two. So epigenetics is the study of environmental influences that actually affect the expression of certain genes, both for the individual and their descendants. So it looks at, it's been examined through cross-fostering studies of development. So rats who are born to anxious moms, therefore have, that diathesis of genetic influence on anxiety, but are raised by calm mothers through laboratory settings, that is a calm environmental influence, tend to grow up calm. In this case, what you're seeing is something where the environment overrides the genes, and the reverse can also be true. You can take rats who were born to non-anxious mothers, have them raised by calm moms, and you can see the genetics express themselves despite an overabundance of environmental stress. So neuroscience has become more and more important in the study of psychopathology over recent years. As we learn more about the brain, as we develop better tools for assessing and examining the brain and studying it, we find that it has a large role to play in the development of diseases, including mental illnesses or psychopathology, and also has a massive influence on our behavior, which is what we're essentially looking at here, is abnormal behaviors. We're going to do a quick crash course on the human nervous system. We're not going to go into any great detail. This is not an anatomy class or a physiology class. I just want you to sort of catch the high points here, understand some of the basic structures and divisions within the nervous system, and then we'll talk a little bit how they potentially relate to psychopathology. So the most basic division of the human nervous system is the central nervous system, which is essentially the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is the somatic and autonomic branches, the nerve endings throughout the body outside of the brain and spinal cord. Let's look at an example and a figure from your book. So here we see the central nervous system is essentially made up by all the structures of the brain that we typically think of when we think about the nervous system, along with the spinal cord. And then you have that peripheral division, which is things like the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk a lot about that in the context of anxiety, the somatic nervous system, and then within the autonomic nervous system, we have our sympathetic and our parasympathetic divisions. In terms of structures on a much smaller level within the nervous system, we have to talk about neurons themselves, or nerve cells. So I'm going to show you a figure in just a moment, which will give you a very clear model of this. But essentially, there are a few basic parts of the neuron you need to be familiar with to understand how neuroscience can play a role in psychopathology. The soma is the cell body of a neuron. The dendrites are the branches that receive messages from other neurons. The axon is the trunk of the neuron that then goes off and sends messages to other neurons at the axon terminals, which are these little buds that spread out at the end of the axon where chemical messages are sent. So at the very end of the axon, we have the axon terminal, which is transmitting information neurochemically across a very small gap to the dendrite of another neuron. This is how nerve transmission of information takes place electrochemically within the brain. So neurons are interesting because they operate essentially in an electrical fashion. You know, the EEG and all these ways of looking at the brain function are essentially studying electrical activity within the brain. So this is another good example of a way of thinking, a model of understanding the nervous system. Given our environment and what we're exposed to and our familiarity with electricity, we tend to apply a model that's very similar to how the electrical system in your home might work. But we do have some, strong evidence that the nervous system is actually operating electrically. It may not be identical to the way electricity works within our home, but it is the same process, the same physics often apply. But the communication itself, it happens chemically. So we sometimes call this a neurochemical process, but the idea is that neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that are released by the axon terminals into the synaptic gap. They are then received by the dendrites of the next cell, and the message is then passed along. So here is an image of two cells that are communicating with one another. As I said, the dendrites are those short root-like structures whose job is to receive signals from other neurons, and the axons are the longer extensions from the cell bodies, the soma, that send the information via the axon terminal. So the neurons never actually touch one another, right? There's always this very small gap between those axon terminals and the dendrites of the next cell. The electrical impulse is transmitted when the axon terminal releases a neurotransmitter into the synapse, and they attach to specifically shaped receptors, which then cause either synaptic excitation, which is the encouragement to produce another impulse, or inhibition, which is the prevention of producing another nerve impulse. So it's either activation or deactivation essentially that's going on. But what's happening is the receptors are specifically shaped. Now they're maybe not physically shaped as far as this model is concerned, but that's one way for us to understand it. They are chemically shaped. They are able to be received because of their chemical structure. So let's go back a little bit and talk about some of the anatomy of the brain again. There are primary parts to the brain, and then there are lots of subdivisions within those primary parts. We're not going to go too deep into the weeds on this, but I do want you to understand, again, some of the basic anatomy involved. You have the brain stem, which from an evolutionary perspective is an ancient part of our brain, sometimes called the lizard or reptilian brain. This is where our basic bodily functions are contained. It contains subdivisions of the hindbrain, the midbrain, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus, which rest between the brainstem and the forebrain. But really, the basic functions, the things that keep us alive, are set here. The forebrain, which when we typically think of the image of a brain, we're really seeing that large cerebral cortex that tends to cover the rest of the brain with, the wrinkled outer structure that is sort of so familiar to us. Our higher order functions are contained within the forebrain. The cerebral cortex is the most visually obvious part of that. It is definitely the largest part of the brain, but it also contains the limbic system and the basal ganglia in the forebrain. And we're going to break these down into a little more of their constituent parts. So, in the hindbrain, you really do have the most basic part of the brain to keep us alive and functioning. So, you have the medulla, which regulates things like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. You have the pons, which regulates sleep and wake cycles. And you have the cerebellum, which is involved in smooth physical coordination. So, there's a part of our motor cortex which allows me to move my arm, but it's the cerebellum that allows me to move it in a smooth fashion to do more sophisticated things with my motions. The midbrain, which is also part of the brainstem, coordinates movement with sensory input and also contains a part of the brain called the reticular activating system, or RAS. This contributes to things like arousal and tension, which can itself influence sleep and wakefulness. When we think about the part of the brain that makes us human, the part of the brain that is more unique to our species, we're talking mostly about the forebrain. So most of our sensory, emotional, and cognitive processing all takes place here. All of our so-called higher functions are occurring in the forebrain. The limbic system is specific to emotional processing, aggression. We think it has a lot to do with reward and punishment as well. The thalamus receives and integrates sensory information, and the hypothalamus regulates things like eating, drinking, aggression, sexual activity. The basal ganglia are thought to partially control some motor activity, and the cerebral cortex, which is sort of the seat of consciousness, as it's sometimes referred, is broken into two specialized hemispheres. So it's split right down the middle. There's a structure called the corpus callosum, which is basically a series of nerve transmission material that is in between the two hemispheres of the brain, and they are localized in ways we'll discuss a little more. But each hemisphere has four lobes, and they have specialized processes. So these are the essential lobes of the forebrain in the cerebral cortex. The frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is a fascinating part of the brain. In my work, in working with patients with dementia, we talk a lot about the frontal lobe, especially as it relates to dementias as they get worse. There are some specific types of dementia called frontotemporal dementia that explicitly attack the frontal lobe, but certainly with Alzheimer's and other types of vascular dementias, you can see frontal lobe damage. The frontal lobe is really what makes us human in many ways. It is, I sometimes say it's the civilizing force within the brain. It involves thinking, reasoning abilities, memory to a certain extent. The frontal lobe is also where our inhibitory cortex is located, the system in our brain that allows us to not act upon our initial impulses, to govern and to regulate some of our behaviors, many of which are social in nature. So the frontal lobe is what keeps me from being overly aggressive, confrontational. It's basically like I said, might be considered really the seat of reason. It's the civilizing part of the brain, so to speak. As I'm walking down the street and someone bumps into me, the frontal lobe of the brain is the part of my brain that says, wait, put this in context. Maybe they weren't paying attention. Maybe they're having a bad day. It may be a simple accident. Whereas other parts of my brain might want to react more aggressively or get more angry. I sometimes tell my patients that the frontal lobe of the brain is the thing in a relationship that allows you to stop and say the third thing you want to say in response to a provocation, as opposed to the first thing. So it's a really crucial, important part of our inhibitory behavior and control of impulsivity. The parietal lobe is associated with things like touch recognition and sensory input. The occipital lobe is sort of the computer that runs our vision. The retinas in the eye are actually an extension of brain tissue that are connected by the optical nerve to the rest of the brain. But it's the occipital lobe that takes in all that information from these quote unquote cameras here in our head and incorporates it and makes sense of it and creates an image that we can actually utilize. The temporal lobe is associated with recognition of sights and sounds, long-term memory storage, and so on. I do want to make one point before we look at some images of where these are located in the brain a little pretty quickly, is that these are these understandings about brain specificity are not perfect. And I think it's important that we don't oversimplify the specificity of the brain and say that, well, no, I can point to this exact spot right here that controls this very specific thing. Some of this is generalization. Some of this is not the entire story. There are interactions between all the various parts of the brain. And there are neurotransmitters that are present in various places throughout the brain that serve different purposes. So I don't want you to oversimplify, but these are some general understandings that we've gotten from cognitive neuroscience about the brain. So we're just going to look at a few quick figures from your book, showing you where many of these structures that I've spoken about are here. So you're seeing on the left, you're really seeing the midbrain and the brain stem. And on the right, you're kind of getting this side view of the entire brain structure. And so you can see how the cerebral cortex sort of covers most of the other parts of the brain, with the exception of the cerebellum, which kind of rests at the back of your skull and is visible at the really base of the cerebral cortex. This is an example of the limbic system in the brain. Again, I'm not going to expect you to memorize all of the names of these various parts of the brain anatomy and understand what all of them do, but some important ones to look through here are the frontal lobe, which we mentioned, which involves a lot of reasoning and inhibitory control. The olfactory bulb obviously is involved with our sense of smell. The hippocampus plays an important role in memory. And the amygdala is thought to play a very important role in fear and aggression and anxiety to a certain extent. This is an example of the basal ganglia, which are sort of in the center of the brain here. Includes the thalamus, the putamen, the amygdala as well, is considered part of the basal ganglia, and the caudate nucleus. Again, I just want you to be familiar with roughly where these things are located and how they fit into the overall structure, not the specifics of the anatomy. And this kind of gives you that localization of the brain that I was talking about. So you've got these four lobes of the forebrain that you see here of the cerebral cortex. You've got the frontal lobe, as I said, planning of movements, recent memory, some aspects of emotion, especially inhibition. You've got the primary motor cortex, you have the central sulcus, and the primary somatosensory cortex, which is where we take in senses from the body. And we have the parietal lobe, which also is involved in body sensations. The occipital lobe, as I said, is involved in processing vision, and the temporal lobe includes things like hearing and advanced visual processing as well. What you see on the right here is kind of the breakdown of the cerebral cortex by virtue of which senses are associated with which parts of the brain. The olfactory bulb is right there sort of underneath the front of the cerebral cortex. The occipital, as I said, is really attached to the retina and the eyes and helps us to process vision. The motor and the somesthetic, you can see, are involved with both movement and sense of touch. And then you have the auditory cortex there sort of on the side of the brain. So that's kind of the central nervous system, the hub, if you will, the processor of this computer in our head, so to speak. Again, another model to help us understand. But there is also the peripheral nervous system, which is the extension of all of these aspects that go throughout the body. So there's the somatic branch of the peripheral nervous system, which is really what helps us to control our voluntary muscles and movement. The autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system involves things like involuntary processes. So you've got things like your respiration, your heartbeat, sympathetic and parasympathetic branches, cardiovascular regulation, body temperature, and can be involved in the endocrine system and aids in our digestion as well. So this is a figure that displays the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. You can see that as we, in the sympathetic outflow on the left here, you can see how there are various parts of the spine that are associated with various functions of the body. And it generally goes from head to toe in terms of how it's related. This is why when you have a spinal cord injury, depending on how high up the spinal cord injury is, you may only lose certain functions below a certain point in your body and retain, for example, in the case of like paraplegia, you may retain the control and sensory system of your arms while still having damage to your legs. And of course, there are lots of our systems in our respiration. There's systems of digestion, our cardiovascular system, our reproductive organs. These things are all tied into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Neuroscience has also made some contributions to our understanding of psychopathology in terms of the endocrine system, which regulates the release of hormones. There is the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis. That's a mouthful. This is the integration of the endocrine and nervous systems into one functioning area. Dysregulated hormones are thought to be implicated in some forms of psychopathology. Certainly, dysregulation of hormones can sometimes manifest itself in things that look like certain disorders. We'll talk about this. I have a couple of clinical examples in my early days of graduate school where I was working with a patient that I'll discuss with you in a moment. And this is just where the endocrine glands are located. So interestingly enough, the endocrine system is spread throughout the body. You essentially have certain aspects of the endocrine system which are part of the central nervous system, and then you have obviously the glands in the throat. Whenever you think about, getting an infection and your doctor's feeling your glands, these are the ones, the thyroid, the thymus, and the parathyroid glands, as well as your lymph nodes that are there as well. The liver is part of the endocrine system, the kidneys, the pancreas, and then the reproductive systems that are associated with certain hormones as well. So we mentioned that the nervous system is an electrical system, but communication is through a chemical process. Neurotransmitters are essentially the means by which neurons speak to one another. They are chemicals that are dumped into the synapse that activate the subsequent neuron along the chain in one way or another. So they're chemical messengers that transmit messages between brain cells. And they can take many different forms. I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit of detail, but I just want to give you the basic definitions. So these are the terms we often use to refer to a neurotransmitter. We may say that it is an agonist. Agonists increase the activity of neurotransmitters by mimicking its effects. Just to clarify, I'm sorry, these are not the neurotransmitters themselves. These are the different chemicals within the brain which act upon the neurotransmitter systems. I'm sorry. And we'll get into this when we talk about medications, psychotropic medications that mimic certain chemical substances in the brain. So again, agonists are substances that increase the activity of neurotransmitters by essentially mimicking its effects. So you're tricking the receiver into thinking that something like dopamine or serotonin is present. It acts very similarly to that neurotransmitter itself. Antagonists tend to block the production of neurotransmitters or function indirectly to prevent the chemical from reaching the next neuron. And it can do that by closing or occupying the receptors, by essentially blocking the neurotransmitter from being able to send its message along the chain. Inverse agonists are chemicals that produce the effects opposite to that given neurotransmitter. And we'll talk about these concepts in more detail as we go through each of the neurotransmitters here. The 5 types of main neurotransmitters we're going to talk about in the brain are listed here. Now, there are several others, but these are the ones that we focus on the most in our study of psychopathology. Serotonin, or also known as 5-HT, which is an abbreviation for the chemical structure, is one. Glutamate, which is associated with being our main excitatory transmitter, that produces basically stimulates a neuron to become excited, which means to send that message further along the chain of neurons. GABA, or gamma aminobutyric acid, is a neurotransmitter in the brain that is our main inhibitory neurotransmitter and is associated with both anxiety, and there are certain classes of drugs that directly affect GABA, including alcohol, that we'll talk a little bit about down the road. Norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. If you've ever heard of epinephrine, that is adrenaline, is another neurotransmitter, but these are involved in a number of processes involving activation, excitation, but also tied to the concept of anxiety and rumination, we think. And then finally, dopamine, which is our primary neurotransmitter associated with reward in the limbic system. We generally we seek dopamine as human beings. We find the release of dopamine pleasant. It's associated with pleasure and ecstasy and all kinds of other things like that, but is also associated with reward, whether it's through receiving something pleasurable or praise. It can become a social phenomenon, but what's actually going on in the brain is dopamine release. As we go through this class, we'll talk about how all of these various neurotransmitters are tied in to or are likely associated with different types of psychopathology. So serotonin, as I said, is a very highly studied neurotransmitter in the brain, likely because of the role that it plays in depression. The Along the history of development of medications for depression, the sort of second or third wave of antidepressants starts with Prozac, and Prozac is a drug that is called a SSRI, a selective serotonergic reuptake inhibitor, which we'll talk about in much more detail in our depression chapter. But we do know that serotonin plays a role, we believe, in mood regulation. It influences information processing as well, and dysregulated serotonin, as I said, may contribute to depression. We do know that very low serotonin is also linked to instability and impulsivity. These are some serotonin pathways in the brain. And there are various ways in which it can be manipulated through medications. But what's interesting about this, and what I want you to pay attention to, is that there's not just one specific place in the brain where serotonin is acting. It is throughout various aspects of the brain which have different functions, so that one can assume that serotonin does not play the same role in all of these various places. We're going to talk about dopamine in a moment, and there's some really good concrete examples of this being the case, where a neurotransmitter plays one role in one position of the brain and a very different role in another part of the brain. But serotonin is thought to not only be a neurotransmitter, but is often referred to as a neuromodulator, meaning that by changing the level of serotonin in the brain, you're not just changing the level of serotonin, you're also changing the levels of other neurotransmitters that are modulated or affected by the levels of serotonin. So this is just a reenactment from something we just discussed, but an image that helps you to kind of look at how neurotransmitters are working at the site of the synapse. So if you look here, you can see how neurotransmitters are stored in these little tiny sacs at the end of the neuron, at the end of the axon terminal. An electric jolt makes the sacs merge with the outer membrane of the cell and then eventually release that neurotransmitter into the synapse. The molecules diffuse across the gap and they bind to receptors, which are specialized proteins on the adjacent neuron that are chemically like a lock and key that receive that particular neurotransmitter. As I said, they're broken when sufficient neurotransmitters are present in the synapse, or when enough have been absorbed by the cell, by the dendrite of the next cell, the receptors release the molecules, which are then broken down, they're reabsorbed by the first neuron, or they're stored later for use. Almost like in some cases, there's a reuptake system that kind of vacuums it back up so that it can be utilized again after there's been excitation of the next cell. So drugs like Prozac are intended to enhance serotonin's effect by preventing it from being reabsorbed. So selective serotonergic reuptake inhibitor. So it is inhibiting the process of reuptake, of drawing back in the serotonin that was used in the previous attempt to create a transmission across the synapse. It just leaves it there kind of dumped into the synapse and continues to potentially excite the cell that's next in the chain. So essentially what you're doing is you're releasing extra serotonin into the synapse. And as you see here, there's some drugs that were thought to be used for anti-obesity. Some of you may have heard of fen-phen, things like that. There's been tons of lawsuits because they were dangerous in terms of cardiovascular side effects. So when we start to mess around with things like serotonin, which, as I said, are neuromodulators, there are often unintended consequences. But this is essentially how the process works. And you can see Prozac, this chemical structure of Prozac coming in on the right here, and is stimulating the cell to shut down the reuptake system and leave that serotonin in the synapse. At the bottom, you can see how the proteins that form the receptors are sort of unique in various ways. Like there are 15 different serotonin receptors we know of in the brain, each associated with different function. Norepinephrine, which is also called noradrenaline, we know is involved in alarm responses and basic bodily processes like breathing. Sometimes when people are in respiratory failure or cardiac failure, they will give them an injection of adrenaline, which is related to noradrenaline, and this person will suddenly become very activated and the heart starts racing. And so it's basically utilizing a chemical to stimulate the brain in a way that can, be very helpful in an emergency in some cases. But regardless, norepinephrine is related somehow in alarm responses. And as you can imagine, this is going to tie into some of the concepts in anxiety like panic we're going to talk about later. These are some norepinephrine pathways in the brain. Again, as you see, it's really not quite as diverse as the places that are involved in serotonin, but still throughout the entire cerebral cortex, there's also some receptors down in the brain stem as well. Dopamine is another really important neurotransmitter in the brain. As I've mentioned, it's involved in reward systems, and it has also been implicated in depression, ADHD. One of the really interesting things that we've learned through the early stages of psychiatric medications was some reverse engineering of ideas about two major illnesses that are involved in the brain. One is schizophrenia and one is Parkinson's disease. So there is evidence that the dopamine pathway in the mesolimbic system of the brain involves excessive dopamine. And that this can lead to schizophrenia, or that schizophrenia is associated with excessive dopamine, I should say, in the mesolimbic system. However, there is also evidence that there is a link between reduced dopamine and Parkinson's disease in another part of the brain. So now we're talking about the basal ganglia. What's technically called the nigrostriatal complex is a part of the basal ganglia, and it's part of our locomotor or movement system in the brain. So what you have here is two different illnesses, one of which is associated with excessive dopamine and another which is associated with reduced dopamine. The reason why we came to understand these systems effectively was the very first medications, the very first antipsychotic medications, the earliest stages of drugs that were utilized to treat things like schizophrenia, essentially what we knew they did was that they reduced the level of dopamine in the brain, but they did it in a very global, blunt instrument sort of way. It was not precise, let's say a hammer as opposed to a scalpel. So you take a person who is experiencing prominent symptoms of schizophrenia, what we typically call the positive symptoms, not because they're good, but because they involve the presence of things that are not there as far as the sensory system is concerned. What I'm specifically referring to are hallucinations and delusions, right? These are the very problematic aspects of someone who is actively psychotic, who has schizophrenia. What we found was that when we gave them these drugs, or I should say what the early practitioners found, they gave people with schizophrenia these drugs which decreased dopamine across the board. The hallucinations and the delusions improved. However, because this was a shotgun approach that decreased dopamine everywhere, it also reduced it in that pathway in the basal ganglia that we associate with movement, and produced Parkinsonian symptoms in these patients. So by increasing dopamine, we were having this positive impact on the hallucinations and the delusions in the mesolimbic system, but the inadvertent side effect was the production of Parkinsonian symptoms. Now, when someone has taken these antipsychotic drugs for a while, they may start to develop these symptoms, and they call them tardive. It's called tardive dyskinesia. They're movement disorders. They can sometimes be compulsive motions like in the cheek, in the mouth. They can be tremors. They look very similar to symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And unfortunately, the chronic use of these drugs that are called neuroleptic drugs can produce tardive dyskinesia, which can be a chronic condition even after the medication is stopped. So when you see patients in a clinical setting who are older, who might have gone through the so-called bad old days of psychiatry treatment, we're taking these very powerful dopamine-related, drugs. What they found is that they have permanent symptoms similar, some of which are similar to Parkinson's disease, the condition being called tardive dyskinesia, because of the use of those medications, which were not as precise as we'd like them to be. Some of the subsequent medications that have been developed, the what are called atypical antipsychotics, the more modern versions of these drugs, tend to be a little more precise and a little more targeted, and sometimes preserve the levels of dopamine in one area while decreasing dopamine in the mesolimbic system, which helps with those symptoms. These are just examples of these two dopamine pathways I was saying in the brain, two major places. This mesolimbocortical system is the one we associate with schizophrenia. The other, the substantia nigra and the basal ganglia section, is the one we associate with Parkinson's disease. So what are the implications for psychopathology when it comes to neurotransmitters and neurological structure? Basically, we think that certain types of brain activity are associated with abnormal behavior. That should be pretty, patently obvious to most people. If there is a a malfunction or a dysfunction in the brain of some sort, that likely may be resulting in behavior which is outside of the norm. So some theories that are out there regarding OCD, for example, patients have increased activity in part of the frontal lobe. It's called the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. If you give someone an effective treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder, and I'm not just talking about medications, I'm talking about psychotherapies and cognitive behavioral approaches, what you'll find if you then go back and study levels of neurotransmitters in this area of the brain is that the overactivity is reduced after effective treatment. So this is the type of evidence that we use to support these arguments, this model for psychopathology. There is a lot of supportive evidence for neuropsychological models. As I said, one of the most powerful ways in which we support this model is through psychopharmacology. And in fact, it's sometimes, as I said, reverse engineering. It's, chemists create a drug. They know effectively what that drug does on a neurochemical level. You administer that drug. So for example, I may have, prior to any theories about serotonin being implicated in depression, I may develop this drug like Prozac, hypothetically. I know this drug based on its chemical structure and what it does, and through observation and investigation, I know that it increases serotonin at the synaptic cleft, right? That it increases the amount of transmission of serotonin. I then give this medication to someone, and I happen to note, either intentionally or unintentionally, that depression gets better. You therefore then can work backwards and say, well, perhaps there's something about levels of serotonin, specifically not enough, that are related to depression. So by studying what the drugs do in the brain and then looking at the psychological symptoms, we sometimes work backwards to develop theories about neuroscientific models for psychopathology. So psychopharmacological studies clearly demonstrate that certain drugs increase or reduce certain neurotransmitters in the brain, and that by doing so, it can be helpful in treating things like depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety disorders. But I do think it's important to understand these are models that are then tested and examined. We don't just sort of sit with that reverse engineering and accept it as truth, but it is kind of an indirect way to arrive at some of these theories. And in the early days of these models, I think they were oversimplified. Things like saying depression is just due to not enough serotonin in the brain. That is a vast oversimplification of how depression is probably manifested on a neurochemical level. We'll talk in the depression chapter a little bit more about why that's a suspect one-to-one correspondence. There are a lot of biochemical studies that are done to support neuroscience models. As I said, we know that most psychiatric drugs affect one of these five basic neurotransmitters. We'll talk about each of these a little bit. So norepinephrine, for example, occurs widely throughout the central nervous system. It regulates mood, and it may increase arousal or alertness. It's often associated with mood and eating disorders in the research. Dopamine, concentrated in fewer areas of the brain, especially, as I said, control of the muscles and things like that. But we think that excess dopamine is associated with schizophrenia. One way in which we make this connection is certain drugs, hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, all of these things, they act in the raphe nuclei and they increase dopamine, and we believe that is the mechanism by which they cause people who've ingested them to have hallucinations. So that is some confirmatory evidence, some concurrent evidence to help the argument that perhaps the emergence of hallucinations in schizophrenia in the absence of drugs may be due to increased dopamine in places like the raphe nuclei. Serotonin occurs throughout the brain, it's present throughout the brain, and it works more or less in opposition to norepinephrine. So suppressing activity, causing sleep. If you've ever heard the old adage about, people get really sleepy on Thanksgiving because they eat turkey and eat a lot of turkey, and turkey has tryptophan in it. Tryptophan is through a metabolic process eventually translated into serotonin. There's drugs like melatonin, which is also a chemical precursor of serotonin, which are thought to help with sleep, an over-the-counter example of a sleep aid. So we've linked it with mood disorders, eating disorders, anxiety as well in serotonin. Acetylcholine is one we haven't talked about yet, but this is also one of the most widespread neurotransmitters throughout the brain. It occurs in systems that control muscles, attention, and memory, and we believe that reduction of levels in acetylcholine is associated with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And finally, let's talk a little bit about GABA. It is also widely distributed in the brain. It works against other inhibitory neurotransmitters and is strongly associated with anxiety disorders. One of the reasons we know that is there are some classes of drugs that decrease GABA and have an anti-anxiety effect. Alcohol, barbiturates, and benzodiazepines all act at the same site in the brain to decrease GABA. So, and of course, all of those drugs are associated with anxiolytic or anxiety reduction effects. All of this is inferred. All of these associations, again, are inferred a little bit through reverse engineering and our known effects of medications on neurotransmitters. It is it's impossible essentially for us to go in and actually measure the level of neurotransmitter in someone's brain. What we can do is we can look at metabolites through things like spinal taps and also through just drawing blood and looking at certain labs. You're not directly measuring, for example, how much serotonin is in the brain, but there are some indicators that can tell us the likely levels of those based upon things, like I said, cerebrospinal fluid and blood tests. Another caveat I want to reiterate really quickly is that many neurotransmitters don't just act directly, they act as neuromodulators that affect the other neurotransmitter levels. This is most obvious in what's called the delay of the antidepressant effect of drugs like Prozac. So as I said, we can study metabolites of neurotransmitters. We can get a sense of what your levels are without actually going into the brain and testing that. But we do know that when you give someone an SSRI, a drug like Prozac, within a very short window of time, a day or two or three at most, neurotransmitter levels are changing. Serotonin, for example, is going up based upon metabolite examinations. But for any of you that have ever taken a drug like this, one of the things hopefully you were told by the person prescribing it is this will not work right away. It will take anywhere from most people 2 to 6 weeks to really be effective and start to see reduction in depression. There is a black box effect. We do not know what is going on in that window, but they theorize that perhaps serotonin is going up, but serotonin is also modulating several other neurotransmitters, and that is why it takes a while for this antidepressant effect to emerge. All of this leads us to hopefully come to the conclusion that most of these processes in the brain are not simple. They are not a one-to-one correspondence between this neurotransmitter and this part of the brain and this related behavior as a result. We know that neurotransmitters are more complex than that, that often there are multiple neurotransmitters involved in behavior, and that the function of a neurotransmitter in one part of the brain can be radically different than it is in another part of the brain. See dopamine as it relates to Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia. There are, of course, critiques of biological models. As I said, the direction of causality is not necessarily clear. We have started to understand a lot more about this sort of interaction between the environment and the brain. What's really fascinating is that, let's just say that we take it as gospel that serotonin is related to depression. We don't know that for a fact, but we have plenty of evidence to support that it has at least some relationship to it, right? And then what happens is you give the person not a drug, but you give them cognitive behavioral therapy, or you change their environment and decrease their stress. And then what you see is the neurotransmitter levels actually change as a result of the environment, one would infer. So the direction of causality is not necessarily clear. It's not as simple as the neurotransmitter goes up or down and the behavior pops out of the end of this system. There's a tendency towards oversimplification in biological models, which is why we have things like the diathesis stress theory and the gene-environment interaction ideas. We're trying to take genetic, and by genetic I also mean biological influences, and incorporate them into how there's an interaction and an interplay with the environment. Another thing that has been said about biological models as a critique is that it can foster helplessness in patients by eliminating their responsibility in the treatment process. There are certain illnesses, certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia that I think there is very strong evidence are probably due to a dysregulation of something like dopamine in the brain. That there probably is a very strong biological evidence that this is, an illness that is due to a biological dysfunction. There's also lots and lots of evidence for the genetics of schizophrenia, which would support that argument. However, if you were to inform a patient you have a biological weakness that cannot be overcome for something like depression or anxiety, what you're potentially doing is you're instilling in that person a belief that there's nothing I can do to change this. It just is what it is. I'm going to have it, which is not necessarily the case based on the evidence. There are lots of various effective treatments. So it can engender helplessness in someone because they're essentially thinking, well, I can't change my biology. I'm just the way I am. We now know that there is an interaction between the environment and the biology, and that through treatment of various types, we can in fact alter the biology, so to speak. So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind. Many disorders are thought to have non-existent or very weak biological causes, but are rather primarily a result of social and environmental influences. Things like phobias, eating disorders, we think have a strong indication for that. To attribute mental illness solely to a biological cause is a very strong oversimplification, and the majority of human diseases are multifactorial. So genes are embedded in their environments, in our physical and social environments as well. So it's important that we don't just say it's just biology and leave it at that. We need to understand this is simply one model that needs to be integrated and incorporated into our model of psychopathology. Now I'd like to step away from the biological neuroscience models and talk a little bit about what are called psychosocial influences on brain structure and function. We know that psychological influences on the brain can change neurological activity, and can sometimes be, for example, as a result of psychotherapy. So this is the suggestion that the environment influences the biology, that it's not a one-way street, that it can go back and forth, and that there's a very dynamic interplay between the two. Another example is how placebos can change brain function. Psychotherapy itself is a strong supporter, and its efficacy, as indicated by research, is a strong supporter of the idea that psychosocial influences affect brain structure and function. And we certainly know that stress in early development can have as great or even greater impact on the development of psychopathology compared to pre-existing biology, so to speak. So it's an interaction of psychological factors with the brain structures and the function. There are certain developmental disorders that we would assume are likely due to biology, but also may not manifest themselves if the environment is one way or another. And we know that the environment itself can, over time, alter the structure of the brain in certain ways. So a more stimulating environment seems to promote neurodevelopment, for example. A sense of control over the environment, what's called an internal locus of control, appears very important in the development of psychopathology, and this comes entirely from your upbringing. There's examples of monkeys being given neurochemicals designed to trigger extreme anxiety, but monkeys that were raised in an uncontrolled, chaotic environment responded with panic to these drugs. Monkeys raised in a controllable environment that was more calm and structured responded with aggression. So you got the exact same neurochemical being introduced into the brain, but the environment is dictating how it manifests itself in terms of behavior. There are great contributions from cognitive science and behavioral science, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of these examples. The most classic, of course, being classical conditioning. So we're going to talk about conditioning processes and how they're related to cognition. So the earliest research is on classical conditioning. Of course, you've all heard of Pavlov's dog, research by Ivan Pavlov. Or John Watson, but the idea was there are simple associations that are learned or connections that are formed between two things that tend to occur together. In the classic Pavlovian dog, there's the delivery of the food along with the ringing of the bell, right? The unconditioned stimulus. And so you start to get these things connected in the brain of the dog to the extent that when the bell is rung in the absence of food, the dog still salivates, right? Which is now the conditioned response to the bell. So it's really just a simple pairing of events because they're close to one another in time. You can look at this play out if the further away from for example, the delivery of the food that the bell is, the less conditioned the dog will become to salivate to the bell. So they happen to be co-occurring. As they co-occur, you start to make these connections. So later research beyond these initial stages of conditioning research show that it's not always that simple, that there are some much higher level cognitive processes that are involved as well. This is the sort of classical conditioning example. This is a study by Robert Rescorla, which is sort of um, building upon Pavlov's classic example, but he was showing something called contiguity, which is that you pair a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, and it doesn't result in the same kind of conditioning. So the dog in the contiguity only group, the top panel, experiences the usual conditioning procedure. Pairing a tone with meat causes the tone to take on the properties of the meat, meaning that the dog salivates. For the dog in the contiguity and random group, the meat appeared away from the tones as well as with it. So sometimes the tone would appear in the presence of the meat, sometimes it would appear in the absence of the meat. It made the tone less meaningful. It didn't produce a strong conditioned response in the dog, and in fact, it sort of creates a sense of confusion. The point here is that you're more able to acquire associations between two things if they occur only together. So for instance, this is the example from your book. If your girlfriend wears a certain perfume, you will associate the smell of her with more, you will associate that smell more with your girlfriend than if your girlfriend and your mother wear that perfume, for example. The contiguity is the idea that the closer the things are uniquely tied to one another, the stronger you see the response. So there are other types of learning that were established beyond the classical conditioning models that began in the early days of psychological research. Respondent and operant learning, these are other ways of conditioning. Learning to repeat behaviors followed by desirable consequences and decreased behaviors followed by undesirable consequences. This is also sometimes called operant conditioning. The basic idea is that whether or not we engage with a behavior or continue to repeat that behavior is based upon whether or not we are rewarded or essentially punished as a result of it. There's also a phenomenon that comes from the research of Martin Seligman called learned helplessness, and he first demonstrated this in animal models with dogs, but it is a robust finding that's been repeated multiple times, and the idea is basically that it could an animal who is punished on a non-contingent fashion. So, for example, an animal might be taught to through operant conditioning to escape an electrical shock by jumping over a barrier. This is the classic example of Seligman's research on learned helplessness with dogs. In the condition where the dog receives the mild shock, whether it jumps over the wall or not, that dog will start to essentially just lay there and take the shock as opposed to attempting to avoid it. And he inferred from this some possible connections to how depression works in the brain and developed a theory called learned helplessness. You might think about learned helplessness in our human minds as the idea that no matter what I do, it's not going to change my situation, so why bother? And as you can imagine, that's a useful model sometimes for thinking about the maintenance and also the treatment of depression. There's some other examples of animal studies done by people after Seligman, like rats given occasional shocks, and they eventually give up trying to control the shocks if their attempts are ineffective. As I said, they've learned not to bother trying. Other types of learning include the work of Albert Bandura on social learning and modeling. He basically says that we learn to copy the behaviors of others when they turn out well for them. So we are not only experiencing punishment and reward ourselves through our own experience, but that we can observe others and learn through their own consequences. So if we see someone doing something that seems effective, we may learn to copy that behavior. If we see someone doing something that's ineffective or results in some sort of loss or punishment, we may be less likely to engage in that behavior. And then finally, there's a concept called prepared learning, which comes from the behavioral and cognitive research that says that it's easier to learn associations that would have been helpful to our ancestors. This is kind of saying that there is an evolutionary understanding of things that are helpful, help us to survive at least long enough to pass along our genes. So it's easier to acquire a fear of spiders because it was adaptive for your ancestors to fear spiders or snakes. Animals that were poisonous. It's much more difficult to make you afraid through a conditioning process of a refrigerator than it is of a snake, for example, because of that prepared learning, which is probably something that's passed down through evolutionary psychology, into our genes, into our DNA, because of the likelihood that engaging with those types of things like spiders or snakes would make it less likely that you would end up passing along your genes, and therefore that would not be selected for in the natural selection process. People who were not fearful of snakes or spiders would be less likely to pass on their genes. So the behavioral model eventually sort of gave way a little bit because it can be regarded as too mechanistic, right? It takes out our free will and our thinking processes. And so, in a response to the behavioral model, but also in an offshoot, the cognitive model became a little more dominant. The basic idea being you are what you think, that your thoughts, your conscious thoughts, mediate your emotions, your states, your behavior. From a cognitive perspective, your thoughts precede everything. You don't just feel an emotion, at least in most situations, but rather how you think about your situation, how you interpret events, how you interpret interactions is what then leads you to feel and then subsequently behave a certain way. So this can be brought into the psychopathology world by saying people create their problems by the way they think or the way they interpret events and situations. Some of the most influential people associated with this are Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, two of the sort of respective fathers of cognitive or cognitive behavioral therapies. So Beck and Ellis really proposed that cognitive processes are at the center of behavior, thoughts, and emotion. When we start using the word behavior in this way, I want to clarify a little bit. If you ask someone like Ivan Pavlov or John Watson about behavior, they mean overt, observable behavior. A dog salivating, a person shaking, or whether or not a dog jumps over a boundary to avoid a shock. As we get further along into psychology and psychopathology, when we use the term behavior, it's a little more all-inclusive. It's not just overt physical behavior. It starts to be incorporated into things like feelings and emotion as well. So what these theorists like Beck and Ellis were saying was that we can best understand abnormal psychology, psychopathology, by looking at cognition, by studying the thoughts themselves. So Aaron Beck is considered the father of what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy. Albert Ellis, who was around the same time, we're talking 40s, 50s, 60s, was involved in rational emotive therapy, which is sort of an early precursor to modern cognitive behavioral therapy. The basic idea, though, is that clinicians have to ask questions of their clients, of their patients, about their assumptions and their attitudes and their interpretations and how they color that individual's experience. So let's think about an example that you can probably relate to. Okay, if you've ever gotten a grade on an exam that you were unhappy with, that you did poorly on an exam, there are multiple interpretations of that event. One individual may receive a poor grade and say, "God, I'm really worthless. I must be an idiot." That's how they interpret that event. That's the cognition that is connected to the event. Another person might say, they might lash out at the instructor. That test was unfair. They might interpret it as being more of a victim. Another might say, hey, this is an opportunity for me to learn. I really need to buckle down and do better next time. I'm capable of doing better. They might say it was something about the circumstances as opposed to attributing it to something essential about themselves. Same event interpreted lots of multiple different ways, and therefore the person is going to experience very different emotions and behave consequently in a different way based upon those interpretations. So this is sort of the core idea behind cognitive models. So Beck's cognitive theory is really tied into a basic concept that he said that there's a three-tiered hierarchy of cognitive content. He called it it's also called Beck's cognitive triad. And he thought this was a really core component of reinforcing and establishing depression in people. So he said that people that were depressed tended to have strong negative beliefs, erroneous beliefs, right? Overly negative beliefs about themselves. For example, I'm defective, I'm worthless. The world, there are insurmountable difficulties that I cannot overcome, and the future. essentially hopelessness. And he said that this cognitive triad, whenever was present, was much more likely to see a manifestation of depression, and it also would lead to more difficult process of treatment because that person would have such strong negative beliefs about these three aspects of the world around them. So the idea behind these cognitive models, whether it's Beck or Albert Ellis, which we'll talk about a little bit, is basically that psychopathology is caused by one of two processes: actual, irrational, and maladaptive assumptions in thought. Okay, I'll define those, so irrational, not based on reason, not based on evidence. Maladaptive, meaning they are not helpful, they are counterproductive. So there's these misassumptions, these maladaptive assumptions and thoughts about yourself, the world, the future, and then distortions in the actual thought process. So it's the basic idea is that we have ways and styles or schema, they sometimes refer to these as, for interpreting the world around us, and that may help to reinforce psychopathology. We distort things in a way that is unhelpful, which is more negative than it should be, irrationally so, or is not productive. Albert Ellis took a slightly different tack at this, but very similar viewpoint, and he really established the idea that emotional and behavioral problems are the result of evaluations, interpretations, and reactions to life events. And he was the first cognitive behavioral therapist to introduce this idea of what we call ABC. There's various various versions and subtypes of this ABC model, but at the core of almost all cognitive behavioral therapy or theory is the ABC model, which is the A is the activating event, the antecedent, if you will. So this is whatever happens to the person in their life, whatever event happens to occur, and then their immediate interpretation of that event. That is then processed through their beliefs, their assumptions, their evaluations that are either rational or irrational. And that leads to the C, the consequence, which is the feeling, the behavior, and subsequent thoughts that are tied to that concept. So the consequences, as you can see, are not a direct result of the activating event. They are mediated and processed through the beliefs. So our reactions are what cause us to feel certain feelings or to behave in certain ways, as opposed to the events themselves. So human beings are of course capable of both rational and irrational thinking, and our distress and maladaptive behavior, our psychopathology, from this perspective, from under this model, is the result of faulty thinking, right? Or sometimes they call them thinking errors. Irrational thoughts, false beliefs are conditioned early in life through our childhood experiences, and they can be reinstilled by what's called autosuggestion and self-repetition. If you tell yourself this maladaptive way of looking at the world enough, over and over and over, you will start to believe it. It will start to become a template that you put onto the world and that you use to interpret events. So there's really some examples of Albert Ellis. You can go watch some videos on YouTube of Albert Ellis doing therapy sort of for an audience, as part of an educational video. He was very confrontational. He would always go at people pretty hard, and he would always try to find whenever they would start to manifest the irrational belief, he would hone in on that and he would attack it. So for example, there's this footage of him treating a young woman who I should say young woman. I think she was, early 30s, and she had a history of poor self-esteem and depression. And she kept saying the phrase, I feel like I'm a little girl. And he would attack her and say, attack her is a strong word, but he would say, are you a little girl? He would be very confrontational, and he would force her to answer the question. He was trying to help her to see the irrationality of her belief system, that she was disempowering herself by thinking of herself as a child in many situations. Albert Ellis was also pretty crass. He used to he likes clever turns of phrase to explain some of his ideas. He thought that irrational thinking can sometimes operate from sort of dogmatic, absolutist, black and white thinking. So for example, the word should is a way that some people maintain their depression and their anxiety. They beat themselves up with the word should. I should be doing this. I shouldn't be doing that. And Albert Ellis would say, stop shoulding on yourself. So he clever turn of phrase. We might call it a dad joke today. He also got into the idea of musts. I must do this. I must do that. I mustn't do that. And he called that masturbatory activity. So he liked to sort of be a little provocative and utilize some play on words to get people to be aware of some of these irrational beliefs that they had. These are some examples from Albert Ellis and his co-author Harper from 1961, so we're going way back now, of various irrational assumptions that one might have. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but for example, a person must be thoroughly competent, adequate, and successful in all respects. On its surface, not necessarily the worst thing, but when you think about it for a moment, it does not allow for failure. It doesn't allow for us to learn and develop and get better at things. We have to be competent right out of the gate all the time. You're going to always be able to find examples of yourself failing to meet this irrational expectation. It is right to be terribly preoccupied with and upset about something that may be dangerous or fearsome. To an extent, but not all the time, right? And not terribly preoccupied. The past is all important because something once strongly affected someone's life, it should continue to do so indefinitely. Many people, especially those dealing with PTSD and depression, are often hung up on very specific events, traumatic events in some cases, and the idea that they are defined by those events, as opposed to that those things are in the past and are written, but we can't adjust how we believe or think about them to try and get better. There are some strong criticisms of cognitive models now. Some of the behaviorists that came before these cognitive psychologists were critical, including B.F. Skinner, perhaps the most famous behaviorist of all time. He was from an early stage of psychology in the 20th century that was extremely focused on applying empirical method, applying the scientific method to psychology, which meant observable behavior, right? So for B.F. Skinner, behavior is not an all-inclusive term that involves feelings and thoughts. For him, behavior is overt. It is what we do. It has to be observable behavior. So he warned as late as 1990 that cognitions, thoughts, are not observable phenomenon and therefore cannot be forming the foundations of an empirical understanding of psychology or psychopathology in this case. It was attacked by humanists for its idea of reducing human beings to the sum of their cognitive parts. My problems are all just due to my errors in thinking, is a little bit dismissive of a person's quality as a human being. They can sometimes be very direct and even confrontational, especially some of the early practitioners in their therapeutic approach. And the humanist argued that this might overpower the autonomy of the client as well. Nevertheless, the cognitive model grew out of and shares a lot of DNA, no pun intended, going back to our previous discussion, with the behavioral world. So the behavioral school was the beginning of this process. The cognitive and the cognitive behavioral hyphenated school really grew out of it. We do know that behavior can be altered, and we found that one of the things that was positive, I think, that was coming out of this cognitive model was a de-emphasis on all childhood behaviors or childhood early experiences. We also know that insight into a problem is not necessary to change it in some cases, so it's not all inclusive. So reliance on experimental methods can validate techniques, and this overlap between cognitive and behavioral models that were more focused on hard science is what really led to the cognitive behavioral school of therapy. Now, cognitive science, interestingly enough, kind of comes back around to some concepts from Freud in an interesting way, and this is the idea of the unconscious. So we do know, to the chagrin of pure cognitive psychologists, there is some disassociation between behavior and consciousness. There are things like implicit memory, acting on the basis of experiences that we cannot recall specifically. There's a phenomenon called blind sights. This is people who are blind but can still sense objects that would be in their visual field even if they do not experience sight. So the cognitive psychologist would say the reason why this person is able to still have this sense of a sense that they've never experienced is because of the unconscious mind. And of course, there are plenty of experiments that actually support the evidence for what they call implicit reasoning. There is something called the IAT, the implicit apperception test, which you can take online for a variety of different settings. And what it's been really useful actually in helping people to understand implicit biases towards race, age, disability, things like this, gender. And so there is evidence that even someone who may consciously endorse certain types of beliefs and certain types of understanding or assumptions about the world may be engaging in some implicit, processing, and therefore is disconnected between their thinking and their behavior. There's something going on which is essentially outside of or unconscious in this process. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of my favorite aspects of psychological models for psychopathology, and those are the humanistic and the existential models. Now, I'm a little biased because I did study philosophy as an undergraduate, and I've always had a real interest, especially in existential psychologists. I'm sorry, existential philosophers. So, humanistic theories are a pretty significant departure from what we've talked about thus far. You can argue that they have their roots in philosophical and Eastern religious systems to a certain extent. These models emphasize and stress freedom, responsibility, dignity, and the inherent goodness of human nature. Humanists are associated with a more optimistic view of human nature as far as our human potential for self-actualization. Carl Rogers is one of the fathers of sort of humanistic models, and he was a psychologist who worked primarily in the mid-20th century, and his beliefs reflected a deep concern for human welfare, a deep conviction that humanity is essentially good at its root, and that we can be more forward-moving and trustworthy of one another in our interactions. Both of these approaches, the humanistic and existential models, can be thought of as phenomenological, which is a philosophical term that basically stresses the understanding of the individual's subjective world experience. So there's a real emphasis on every individual being unique. Whereas in the biological and the behavioral models especially, you start to see much more of a mechanistic explanation of behavior, including psychopathology. The humanistic models are much more focused on the individual and the subject rather than the object, so to speak. So there is much more of an emphasis on understanding and respecting the individual who is dealing with these problems and meeting them where they are as well. So as I said, Carl Rogers is most associated with humanistic approaches, as well as Abraham Maslow. Maslow argued that in every person there is an active force striving towards self-actualization. Supportive environments are thought to cultivate the development of a quote-unquote fully functioning or actualized person. Environments that frustrate this natural tendency towards self-actualization are what result in psychopathology. So Maslow might argue that given the right environment, we are all capable of this higher level of self-actualization, but when there are deficits or when there are negative things within that environment, they decrease the likelihood that we will reach that point of understanding. There's also an extremely heavy emphasis on acceptance of others as well and being non-judgmental. So Rogers is associated with a type of therapy called client-centered or person-centered or person-oriented therapy. Maslow was interested in improving the mental health of not only the disturbed, but the quote-unquote normal people. And in this sense, Maslow was actually way ahead of his time. There is a whole school of psychology called positivistic psychology. It's associated with Martin Seligman more than anyone else, but this is the idea that we don't need just to study psychopathology, we need to study quote-unquote normal, healthy development as well. But basically this idea of Maslow is that people are motivated not only to satisfy their biological needs, but to cultivate, maintain, and enhance the self, your image of yourself, the I, the me. We're striving towards this realization of your potential, according to Maslow, and this is sort of the model of understanding psychopathology as someone who is being deterred or somehow cut off from an opportunity to reach that stage of their own development. So these humanistic theories and how they apply to psychopathology is that societal restrictions, circumstances, environments keep us from attaining self-actualization. Also, this idea of a society that's very tied to conditions of worth. This idea that there are standards that help people determine whether or not they have worth. And this is transmitted through something that Carl Rogers called conditional positive regard. The idea here is that someone is going to treat you with respect and show that you have value depending upon what you do, how you perform, how you comport yourself. This is an issue for Rogers. He focused on what he called unconditional positive regard as being a key component of person-centered therapy. The idea that the therapist would regard the individual as having value without any conditions placed upon that. You've heard of the term unconditional love, right? The idea that you love someone regardless of circumstance or what they do or what they don't do. The unconditional positive regard is a similar idea from Rogers, that this is what people need in their lives, and that conditions of worth actually keep us from achieving self-actualization and can contribute to us behaving in a way that's maladaptive or abnormal. So this incongruence, this disharmony, is an issue. This reliance on others results in a distorted self-concept that's inconsistent with your own self-actualizing potential. So your self-worth is determined by reliance on approval from others, and Rogers felt that disharmonious persons need that unconditional positive regard that respects the person as a person. Now, this goes way back to some very heavy philosophical thinking put forth by Immanuel Kant. He talked about something called the categorical imperative, the idea that a person should never be treated as a means to an end, but as an end unto themselves. So this idea is to essentially emphasize the reflection of feeling in therapy, reduce distortion, and maintain a non-judgmental approach that relies on the client's strength and potential rather than focusing on their deficits. Existential theories within psychology are most commonly associated with Viktor Frankl, Otto Rank, Rollo May, Irvin Yalom. These are all 20th century psychologists who are associated with this relatively young school of thought. Existential psychotherapy places a strong emphasis on the human condition as a whole. It uses a positive approach that applauds human capacity and aspiration while simultaneously acknowledging our limitations, right? So this idea of developing acceptance for things that I cannot control, but committing to ways in which I can control or make choices that are better for myself, that are more in line with my values. Existential psychologists and theorists really focus on some core givens that are related to psychopathology. These are concepts like freedom and associated responsibility. Right? They talk a fair amount with individuals about mortality and the concept of death. Another key existential concept is isolation. That, you know, as a subject, as a consciousness that is unique unto itself, I am also isolated in that way. I can never fully understand someone else's experience. We share very human characteristics, but I am unique unto myself, and of course tied to the concept of birth and death is that I experience that alone. I may have people surrounding me, but that's my experience at its core. And then of course this idea of meaninglessness, which is really a key part of existential philosophy, which is that there is no inherent or core meaning to our existence, but there's simply what we bring to it, what we develop, what we instill in terms of meaning. So this approach is derived from philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, all of these sort of bigwigs of the existential philosophy world. Existential theories became popular after World War II. As psychologists attempted to understand the horrors of the war. Viktor Frankl is a really good example of this. Viktor Frankl was a pretty straightforward Freudian psychoanalyst, living in Austria, and when the war broke out, Viktor Frankl was also Jewish, and Viktor Frankl survived, I can never remember exactly, but I think it was 2 or 3 of the most deadly concentration camps during the Holocaust, and Viktor Frankl essentially got a front row seat to observe what arguably is some of the worst of humanity in terms of the Holocaust. And he was sort of shaken to his core by this experience, but also developed an entirely different way of thinking about human behavior and involved what he called logotherapy, which is essentially one form of existential psychotherapy. What he emphasized through those experiences, and he wrote about in an incredible book called Man's Search for Meaning, he talked about self-determination, choice, and responsibility of the individual to rise above environmental forces. What Frankl emphasized in writing about the concentration camps was even in an environment where, for example, a guard could execute a prisoner without any real, punitive effects. Basically, they didn't like the look of you, they could execute you on the spot in some situations where your life was not your own in a very real way. So much of your control was out of your hands, including life or death, where you were witnessing horrors and starvation and all these aspects that we're all too familiar with related to the Holocaust. What he said was that there were still freedoms to exercise, even within those incredibly difficult environments. There were choices. For example, how to carry one's suffering, how to focus on something from one's life, from one's experience that was meaningful, that made sense of that experience, that sort of horrific setting. So he saw the potential for people, even in those worst of conditions, to embrace their humanity and to not be destroyed by it. Existential theories and psychotherapy focus on irrationality, difficulties coping with suffering that we all encounter in our life, the universality of suffering. And they believe that an individual must be viewed within the context of the human condition, which includes moral, ethical, and philosophical context. So the idea here is that there's stresses on responsibility, both for yourself and for other people. It deals with concepts like social and spiritual isolation that we all experience as human beings, especially as the world becomes more technologically and potentially dehumanizing as time goes on. The argument is that psychopathology or dysfunction is caused by self-deception. By our tendency to hide from our freedom and our responsibility and fail to realize or accept that it is up to us to give our lives meaning. And this can lead people to feeling empty or inauthentic, where their dominant emotions are things like anxiety, frustration, boredom, alienation, and depression. So as you can probably guess, in a setting where we've got things like neuroscientific models, cognitive models, behavioral models, biological models, there are criticisms of these humanistic and existential approaches, these models, that they are quote unquote fuzzy, that they're too nebulous and ambiguous in nature, essentially that they're not scientific enough. Perhaps they're only applicable to a restricted population. I will say that in many situations when you're treating someone, if they are not interested in exploring some of these heavier philosophical concepts like death and isolation and meaninglessness, or if they're not intellectually in a place or from a background where that's something they feel comfortable engaging with or talking about in a way that makes sense to them, maybe it's not as effective. But ultimately, the argument of these humanists is that these are universals, and you just have to find the right way to approach that person. There is some evidence that these approaches are not as effective with severely disturbed clients. So when I say severely disturbed, I'm talking about people that may be suffering from schizophrenia or in the midst of a manic episode as part of bipolar disorder. I think there's certainly sufficient evidence to say that you're not going to maybe effectively treat schizophrenia or bipolar disorder through the use of only these humanistic or existential approaches. They tend to be less successful in the history of psychology and psychopathology in developing theories or being evaluated empirically. They are skewing more towards the philosophical than the psychological for some people. But nevertheless, these approaches have been extremely influential in modern empirically based or empirically supported treatments, such as acceptance and commitment therapy, which is very popular right now. It's basically ACT is the acronym for acceptance and commitment therapy. Really started gaining prominence about 25, 30 years ago, and it's become extremely dominant in the psychology or clinical psych world these days. And it is considered a third wave cognitive behavioral therapy. So it is an offshoot of Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis and those sort of approaches, but it incorporates a lot of aspects that we might normally associate with humanistic or existential theories. A focus on freedom, choice, responsibility, you're not going to find many clinical psychologists that don't at least discuss these concepts in one way or another with clients. So while it may not be regarded as a dominant or viable approach for treating everything, I think there are ripples throughout the world of clinical psychology that are owed to this sort of humanistic and existential theory approach. So let's talk a little bit about the role of emotion in psychopathology. It may seem obvious, but if you think about it, we haven't talked a lot about emotion itself as being part of a model of why someone engages in disordered behavior or experiences distress or has difficulty with functioning. So we know the nature of emotion is to elicit or evoke an action. From an evolutionary perspective, that's why our emotions are there. And that this is different from just affect and mood. We might think of emotions as having lots of components, behavioral, physiological, cognitive. For example, think about fear as an emotion, right? There are typically, when someone is afraid, there are some cognitive aspects. There are some thoughts. This person's going to hurt me. Something bad's going to happen. What if I fail? I'll be mocked. I'll be unsuccessful. Whatever. Those are all sort of cognitive aspects of the emotion of fear. There are biological or behavioral, physiological. For example, your heart rate might be elevated. You might experience tachycardia. You might start sweating. Your pupils might dilate as you sort of start to ramp up into like a panic state. You might have a tendency or a desire to flee, a behavioral response that's associated with fear, the fight or flight. That's the flight part of it. Many types of psychopathology can be boiled down to problematic reactions to our own emotions. People with social anxiety, for example, don't like the way they feel in social situations. They do not like the emotion that they experience, so they attempt to avoid these situations in order not to feel that uncomfortable emotion if they can possibly avoid it. So this is sort of just a visualization of this from your book, from figure 2.16, where you basically see this overlap, this Venn diagram talking about emotions. We've got emotion and behavior, cognitive aspects, and the physiology of emotion as well. We know that these things are interplaying with one another a lot. For example, hostility and anger are tied to things like cardiovascular problems. This effect may be even stronger than many physiological risk factors for things like heart disease and heart attack and stroke. So we know that there's an interplay between these domains, but that as you look at that sort of center of the Venn diagram, that is often what we are defining as emotion. It has all of these components. So it's something we need to talk about in terms of psychopathology. So suppressing negative emotions increases sympathetic nervous system activity. We know that dysregulated emotions are the key features of many mental disorders. We're going to talk about panic attacks in great detail in our anxiety chapter, but it is a prominent example of essentially fight or flight fear, our strong evolutionary desire to survive, being triggered in the absence of a viable threat. I'll get into this, like I said, in a lot more detail in the anxiety chapter, but if I walk out my front door and there's a black bear on my front stoop, my body is going to do all kinds of things. My autonomic nervous system is going to go into overdrive to keep me alive, right? My pupils are going to dilate in case it's low light. I'm going to start sweating because it's hard to hold on to somebody who's sweaty, right? My heart's going to start pumping to push more oxygen to my large muscle masses. The blood's going to run away from my gut because we know it's not important to digest food in an emergency. You need that blood to go to the large muscles so you can run, you can fight. I might start hyperventilating to try and get hyperoxygenated for that struggle. I will never stop in the presence of that bear and say, oh my gosh, I feel awful. What's wrong with me? Something bad's going to happen. I'm going to die. Only in a panic attack where that system is misfired in the absence of a threat do you suddenly start worrying about what does this mean and interpreting it in a frightening way. So dysregulated emotions are really at the key or at the center of a lot of disorders we're going to talk about as the class goes on. Finally, as we sort of wrap some of this up, I want to talk about cultural, social, interpersonal factors in psychopathology. So as we said at the very beginning of this is an integrative way of defining psychopathology. We are incorporating from lots of models. And one of the major changes and developments in a lot of sciences, but especially in psychology and sociology, over the last several decades is paying more attention to culture, paying more attention to interpersonal factors. So we do know that cultural factors influence the form and expression of behavior in a very powerful way. Children raised to be autonomous are less fearful, and that can be a cultural factor. There are culturally bound fears. One example from Latin America is what's called susto, and this is symptoms of anxiety that occur when the individual believes he or she has been struck by black magic. Now, this may be less and less common, but in certain cultures, this is still a very common belief. And it's very culturally bound. This is not something that occurs outside of these cultures, at least with that label and those particular characteristics. There are, of course, strong gender effects that both can be tied to developments of psychopathology, but also how we label and classify psychopathology, and we'll get into this a little bit down the road. We do know that men and women tend to differ in emotional experience and expression to a certain extent, at least stereotypically. 90% of those that endorse insect phobia are female. Statistically speaking, most bulimia sufferers are female, although we are learning more and more about males that are struggling with bulimia. Alcohol use disorders are more common in men. One might argue, is that biological in nature, but certainly there's some cultural factors and some social factors that play in. We think this, obviously is related to some concepts of gender roles. Certain ways of coping with emotion are considered more acceptable for men or women under certain circumstances. So the way we're defining gender, the way we're defining what it means to be, a certain gender in the society may have an influence on how psychopathology expresses itself. And we'll get more into this as we talk about each chapter covering individual types of disorders. We also know that social support is crucial, the environment socially that the person is in terms of expressions of psychopathology. Low social support is related to mortality, disease, and occurrences, prevalence of psychopathology. The frequency and the quality of social support is, of course, very important. And especially in the elderly, there seems to be evidence that a lot of psychopathology manifesting itself with the types of patients that I see is often tied to diminishing social support as friends, family, spouses might pass away, especially with sort of the way that there's a stronger tendency for children to move away from parents these days, and there's less of a built-in family support system for some people. That can have an impact as we get older as well. A related concept, which I think is really important and I want to address as the class goes on, so hopefully we're going to come back to this multiple times as we talk about various different types of disorders, is the social stigma of psychopathology. This has changed, and it feels like it's changing very rapidly right now, but our psychopathology does not occur in a vacuum. It has cultural, social, and interpersonal context in which it happens. There are a lot of problems in our culture related to how we think about, perceive, and portray psychopathology. The stigma associated with these illnesses or these disorders has changed a lot over the years, but it certainly limits the degree to which people express their mental health problems. So if you're concealing the fact that you're depressed, you're more likely to be unable to receive support from your friends. They don't know that you need help or need support because you're not identifying the condition. Therefore, you're helping to reinforce the situation even more. And certainly, really importantly, is it discourages people from seeking treatment. This is slowly starting to change, and we are seeing some evolution in our understanding as a culture about mental health. There have been some recent high-profile examples in the sporting world of people like Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles sort of acknowledging mental health issues publicly. And as you well know, if you've been following any of these stories, the reactions have been supportive from some and very judgmental and negative from others. And these very brave individuals have taken a lot of flack for being honest about their emotions and how they're dealing with mental health issues. But every time a high-profile figure is open and honest and shares information about this, I think it helps to reduce social stigma. And I think generationally, we are beginning to see some significant shifts. My assumption, and I think I probably could back this up with the evidence, is that the generation of people taking this class, as opposed to my own, have pretty different perspectives on mental health, probably have different comfort levels in discussing mental health alone. When you think about ADHD, for example, there was a time when this was considered like this rare developmental disorder, which was very embarrassing and probably wasn't talked about much. And now it's something that's very openly discussed, very, in terms of testing in schools and things like that. And whenever people are struggling, it's something that's on the table to be talked about. So the more we're comfortable talking about mental health and the more we normalize psychopathology, and that's a bit of a mind twister to think about that, right? We're saying by virtue of it being abnormal, that it's not something that happens to everyone, but we now know that these things occur along a dimension and a continuum, that while not every individual may meet the DSM diagnostic criteria for a major depressive disorder, we all experience sadness. We all experience some sense of negative emotion about ourselves and the world and the future. We're all familiar with what it feels like to be afraid. Maybe with a few rare examples, exceptions like people who are, extreme sociopaths maybe, but the vast majority of us can relate to a feeling of fear and anxiety, even if we've never had a full-blown panic attack, for example. So starting to understand the complexity of mental health issues and the fact that they are not necessarily rare, or that many of them are not rare, and that we share something as human beings, that experience these feelings and these behaviors along a continuum, I think will help to destigmatize mental health issues going forward. So related to that is this idea of the global incidence of psychological disorders. According to the World Health Organization, mental health accounts for about 13% of the world's quote unquote disease burden. This is a difficult, it's difficult to unpack some of this research and exactly what that means, but we do know that it is a significant portion of people's quote unquote health problems are mental health problems. Mental health care is very limited. Some might argue it's very limited in the United States, but it is very limited in developing countries as well. At last note, there was about one psychiatrist per 2 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. That is not a sustainable model for people to receive treatment, at least from a psychiatric perspective. Even in the United States, about 1 in 3 people who meet diagnostic criteria for a mental disorder in the DSM receive any treatment. So there's a huge portion of people who are suffering who are not getting treatment, either through lack of access or insurance, social stigma, lack of understanding, any variety of factors that keep people from seeking treatment or having access to treatment. One of the final things I want to talk about is the idea of lifespan and developmental influences over psychopathology. So developmental psychologists have really entered into the arena of psychopathology model as well by talking about developmental changes that might be related to critical points for development of psychopathology. This idea that our development over the span of our life will influence and constrain what is normal and abnormal at the time. There are certainly behaviors that a 3-year-old engages with that we don't consider abnormal behavior. We don't consider it problematic. But if you do it when you're 33 or 23, we might say, okay, now we've crossed a line here into something that's more consistent with psychopathology. There's a principle in developmental psychology called equifinality. It comes from developmental psychopathology, and it basically says there are several paths to a given outcome, and that paths can vary by developmental stage. So some things are normal at a certain age or stage, and not normal at another, essentially. Let me give you an example of equifinality. There's a phenomenon called delirium. It's in the DSM. Delirium is often regarded as a medical condition, but it is a cognitive mental status problem as well. So there's all number of separate or underlying conditions that can alter someone's mental status acutely. It can be everything from post-operative states, drugs and alcohol, in the elderly especially, urinary tract infections, fever, various organ system breakdowns. Elderly children and elderly individuals and children are more prone to delirium than adults, and are at higher risk for adults. And we know that it doesn't really, the presentation can be from all these various sources, but we know that in various stages of development, these things like delirium are more or less likely, more or less present, and have higher rates in the elderly and then children. So equifinality is that the same outcome can be arrived at from different origins. There's also a phenomenon called multifinality, which is the same origin can end up at different outcomes, right? You take two people, you put them through the same experiences, and for one reason or another, potentially their genetics, potentially something about the way they think, one person develops a disorder and another does not. And so the end lesson, I think, is that, of course, we change over time, we develop over time, over our lifespan, but also that there are various different ways in which we can end up with the same outcome, and that the same experience does not always result in the same outcome either. So in summary, multiple causation is the rule, not the exception. Okay. There are a few conditions that we might make strong arguments for having a little more less complex, I should say, etiologies, less complex causal relationships. But even things like schizophrenia, for example, which we feel is very biologically rooted, we know is not caused entirely by how dopamine works in that part of the brain. There are several other factors, environments and stressors and everything that need to be considered. When you are trying to develop a model, a perspective that's multidimensional of psychopathology, you want to be broad, comprehensive, and systemic. So you think about things like biological and neuroscientific influences along with cognitive, emotional, social, cultural, and developmental factors. You sometimes, like as I mentioned in a previous lecture, you'll see the term biopsychosocial. People will say, we think depression has biopsychosocial etiology. Well, you're basically saying it's a complex interplay of all of these various models together, and that a unidimensional, a one-dimensional model is not sufficient based upon the evidence to capture what causes a particular disorder. A multidimensional approach is more comprehensive, and it puts us in the best position to understand the etiology, the causes of psychopathology, and from that to alleviate, treat, and prevent psychopathology down the road. So by having a comprehensive multidimensional perspective, we are bettering the odds that we will more accurately and in a more valid fashion understand psychological disorders, but also that we'll be able to do something about them.